Sarah.
Yep, I think we can go ahead and get started.
Yeah, I think we're going to get started here. So welcome everybody to the second FAME workshop. I guess last week I was not speaking correctly. It's today that you would potentially meet with your mentors or your coaches, your writing coaches. But today, for the next, I don't know, 45 minutes to an hour, we're going to hear from Dr. Puja Mehta, who's a faculty member in the Division of Cardiology and faculty member and an investigator in the Division of Cardiology. And she's going to talk about developing a background and significance for your proposals. So Puja, is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay, good.
That's great. Thank you. And thank you all of you for joining. And, it's always nice to be invited to give a talk. And I say, oh, this must mean that Charlie and, Charlie and others in charge think that I know a little about writing grants. So I prepared something that's about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we can have Q&A. So this is, I have some research support from NIH and AHA and an honorarium, but nothing related to, their disclosures. And also a big thank you to Dr. Neil Dickert, because I adapted a lot of these slides from him, who has given this talk previously. So I thought that, as I was thinking about this presentation, I was thinking, when did I actually start learning how to write a grant? And if you think about it, most of us who didn't do the PhD route, if we're like the traditional MD, you go through undergrad, you go through med school, look at all the years of education, right? Internal medicine residency. And all I remember thinking is whenever anybody would mention grant, it's just intimidating. That, oh, somebody's writing a grant. That just seems like a big black box. And it wasn't until the beginning. So in cardiology fellowship, the first 2 years, we had an opportunity to do research if you chose the research track at Emory. So that's when I worked with Kathy Grinling, and I first saw a basic science R01 that she had. And looking at it, it was so intimidating. And of course, it was heavy vascular biology, basic grant. But that's where I actually saw that, oh, there's like an AIMS page. That's like the first page. And that's what people talk about, with AIMS and background and what's an NIH biosketch. But I still didn't really write anything until I actually became an instructor and faculty member at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles. And my first grant was a pilot grant, an internal pilot grant for $25,000. And that's when I actually had to put something down to paper. And so here are some examples of grants that I have gotten. And I will tell you that whether it's industry grant or pilot grants that are $20,000 or a big NIH grant that's $2 million, I sometimes feel that the amount of work and the thinking and the planning, there's a lot that goes into it. And once you have the elements and once you kind of say, okay, these are the things that kind of need to be in a grant, then it goes pretty easy in terms of what all you're going to need. But the planning part, I really think is key, because it takes a lot of planning and organizing. So here are some examples. So at K23 training grant, an R01, which I currently have, whether it's an R21, so these are smaller grants, an R03. And I'm just bringing this up because I actually don't know how much the audience here know and don't know. I didn't know, when I just heard these numbers, whether it was a K or an R, and then you hear an R03, R21. So these are basically, smaller grants or R21s, and R03 is a bigger grant, obviously, is the R01. And then the industry sponsored grants, the investigator initiated ones, where I went to the industry and said, here's a grant proposal. And I, for example, with General Electric, my proposal was that, can you please donate 40 MIBG isotopes for cardiac imaging, and each isotope costs about $6,000. So, I just wanted their help getting some isotopes. So I wrote something up for that, but the elements are still the same with the Ames page, background, etc. And then the key point here is unfunded grants. These are blocked out of my mind because they were unfunded, but I'm pretty sure it was number was 12 to 15. So grants 101, work with a mentor who has successfully obtained one, and just making sure that they are responding to your emails, making sure that you had set up a timeline with them, make sure that the mentor is engaged enough to open up your document and make edits and get back to you in a timely manner. All those things. It's needless to say, but very important. Read the RFA for important information. So RFA, request for application, just important information. So if the deadline's there, is it feasible? Is a letter of interest required? Page limits, what's the total funding amount? And then sometimes they'll say, oh, this is a $250,000 grant, but each year you can only request, no more than 150 or something like that. So you'll have to, work on the budget related to that. And then of course the internal routing process through RAS, just making sure that, so for example, if the deadline is November 1st, you'd have to give them, at least have stuff ready for RAS a week or two before in October. So just kind of plan around that. And then contacting the funding agency with the idea that you have to see if they're even interested before you put in all this work to develop the rest of the grant, I think is important, especially for industry related work. Now, other things to remember, of course, is grantsmanship. So what you're basically doing is communicating so that a non-expert reviewer can understand it. So somebody who doesn't know anything about your area can read your grant and say, okay, what is the problem that, Meghna, I see your name first here, so I'm just gonna say it. What is the problem you're investigating? And then what is she proposing? What is the hypothesis that you're testing? So just a clear hypothesis. And then how are you going to prove and disprove your hypothesis? So it's basically convincing the committee that Meghna has the appropriate background. And if she is a younger investigator, then she has a good mentoring team or her co-mentors or advisors. You have to make them kind of believe that what you're proposing is an important problem. You have a clear hypothesis, and then you have to convince them that you will be able to do this in the amount of time that the grant is for, so 2 years, 3 years, 1 year, with the amount of money that you're asking. So organization and clarity is key. If you are confused about elements in your grant, so if you're confused about concepts, or if you're confused about how a particular thing will happen, then it will come through in the grant, and then the reviewer will also get confused. So just making sure that it's clear in your mind. And I tend to really, do a lot of jotting down and drafting with like arrows and exactly what am I trying to do and how does one piece relate to the other, to try to convince somebody that this should be funded. And then the last thing, this is always the hardest because people who are very, very, most of us are busy clinically too, and your mentors and peers are also busy, but really trying to circulate the grant to others. And most people are pretty nice. I've found that, if I contact them and say, hey, do you mind looking at least my Ames page and seeing if it makes sense, if it's clear, do you like it, and get feedback. And this is very important if you're able to do it early. A major criteria is impact. And NIH defines this, and most grants, I say NIH, but I feel like most grants that you're trying to write, you're trying to convince that it's impactful, what you're trying to do. So the likelihood that a project will exert a sustained and powerful influence on the field. So whatever you're proposing, just make sure that you kind of clearly say, findings from this work or completing these aims will lead to X, Y, Z. You know, we expect whether it's the next step for a larger grant or changes in intervention of how something is, you know, how a patient is treated for a particular disease, et cetera. But just how is it going to change the field? The review process, reviewers are busy, this goes without saying. And a handful of applications, you know, reviewers get sometimes, okay, here are your 6 to 10 applications that we want you to review and get, you know, score them. So you really have to grab their interest in the first, you know, page or so. Say, okay, what are they trying to do? And the amount of time that a reviewer puts in to look at the grant for the compensation for their time and expertise is pretty low. So, you know, often there's no compensation. I get asked sometimes to review grants from like, you know, Netherlands or whatever, because I have an interest in microvascular disease. So I'll get asked to review grants related to that. And sometimes you'll say there's no compensation, and sometimes it's like $100 or something. You know, it's not enough for the time that you're going to put in. And then reviewers themselves have their own pressing deadlines. So they're trying to read, you know, they get to your grant last minute to try to review it and submit their scores. So keeping that in mind, sometimes, you know, reviewers will not read the entire application in detail. So if you're burying something important concepts within the application somewhere, you'll often, you know, they may not even get to it or read it. And then you'll get these comments and you're like, well, I mentioned it in the grant on page 9. Didn't they see it? So if you're something important, then I think you need to say it up front, you know, underline it, highlight it, you know, something that, so that it grabs the reviewer's attention. Most of them focus on the abstract and the specific aims page. And if the specific aims page is good, then it will grab their attention and they will quickly make an overall impression based on the organization of the grant. So you flip through the pages. So if it's a 6-page grant, you're going to flip through it and say, okay, are these sections organized well? Is the grant presented well? If any of the initial paragraphs, if they read sloppy, even if the rest of the grant is really beautiful, they're already gonna start looking for other things that they can criticize in the rest of the grant because they thought that the initial, you know, the aims page was sloppy. So I would spend a lot of time on that first page. And then remember again that most of the reviewers may not have the content expertise, specifically details related to the methods of exactly what you're proposing. Or you'll know what you're proposing more than anybody else, right? So you want to just write it clearly so that they can sort of understand, even if they're not an expert in your field. So the applications differ in structure and page limits. The FAME grant is 6 pages. A lot of the federal grants are 12 pages. It can feel like not enough for everything you want to say, but sometimes it's actually better because it really makes you think about what exactly needs to be said in the 6 pages that you have. So it can be a blessing and a curse. And you have to allocate real estate, you know, how are you going to use these 6 pages to, you know, what all you're going to say. So this is part of the planning, where most grants have 3 sections. And this is how I've always written all the grants that I have, because I've just followed the 3 sections rule, is that you have the significance, innovation, and then approach. So those are your main big headers. And we will focus today specifically on significance a little bit, but the entire grant, needless to say, if one section is really good, but the other one is not written well, then it'll fall through. So everything kind of has to be tight. In the FAME pilot grants, because they're shorter, it's 6 pages, it's background and significance, and then experimental design and expected outcomes. And then the teaching grants are a little bit different. The FAME teaching grants, where you talk about the current state of the teaching of what is happening in the proposed area, and then what is your proposed program, and then how will you assess the whether that program was successful, and so how will you implement the program and how will you evaluate it? So it's a little bit of a different structure. But this is a Neil Dickert slide, which I really liked. And this is what you want to avoid. So sometimes reviewers are reading the grants on the plane, or just at night, and say, what are they writing? So just make it clear and easy to read. And that's why planning is very important. The other thing is that the overall hypothesis and the specific aims page, whatever you propose there, it's okay to repeat it again in the rest of the, the significance and the innovation. So sometimes, it's like, well, I already mentioned that in the aims page and in the abstract. That's okay. Go ahead and mention it again a couple more times, so that in case they're skimming, they actually get it. Now, specifically for significance section, this section is supposed to explain the importance of the problem and describe sort of the critical barriers to progress that you're trying to address. And usually this is about a page, 1.5 to 2 pages, usually about a page and a half for most of the things that I've submitted. And then you want to explain how your proposed project will improve knowledge. If it's more of a technical grant, if it's more of a imaging focused grant or a technique related to, lab technique, then how will this change or build on what is currently done? And then how will it improve clinical practice in your field? So you want to describe the concepts, methods, whatever it is that you're proposing, how is it going to change the field? And if this comes across clearly, then that would be good. And I got this from NIH Quick Guide to Grant Applications. So you're making a compelling case. So basically convincing the reader that this study needs to happen, and that there's a strong scientific premise for the project, that, here's sort of summarizing what is known in this field, and then what is missing or what is not known. So highlighting literature citations, of course, and don't highlight old, unless it's classic, papers or research that you really have to. I wouldn't, highlight. You're not trying to give them everything related to your area, but things that are relevant specifically to the problem that you're proposing to study. So for example, if I'm writing a microvascular grant, I'm not going to give them, 30 years of microvascular research about everything, but I'm going to specifically say, okay, this is what's known about, like, for example, if I'm proposing to study sex differences, or if I'm proposing a specific technique to improve diagnosis of microvascular, or if I'm proposing a therapeutic, then summarizing what is not known, as a sort of the next logical step is what I would focus my significance section on. And you want to highlight rationale. I don't know, for whatever reason, I was told a few years ago that you want to have something that's clearly, the rationale for this work is, and then how this field will improve in public health. So answer this so what question early, and then often, like I said, throughout the grant, kind of just say, okay, why do you want to do this again? Remember, I want to do this because X, Y, and Z. And then linking your so what to what the funding announcements priorities are. Those, if the request for application is about ethnic disparities or improving minority health, then bring that up early on in the background and the significance section and say, therefore, in response to this RFA, to improve ethnic, to improve health disparities work, this grant will lead to X, Y, and Z. So specifically kind of say why this project is appropriate for this RFA. And then, of course, framing your project effectively. So you clarify the gaps and make it seem like the most logical thing. Like, it's almost like this X is known, Y is known, the next thing is, but Z is not known. And of course, we need to know Z. And so this is why this study needs to happen. Make the sections scannable, and then anticipate the questions, the common questions that they'll have, things like, is this enough? If your N is 100, they're going to know, well, is this enough N to answer this question? So you have to justify why you picked 100. If you say, I'm going to check blood at 6 hours, you have to justify why 6 hours and not at 10 hours or 12 hours. What is it based on the literature that somebody else has looked at, and that's why you're picking 6 hours? So, just some of the questions that they will likely ask. And this is why it's also important to circulate your grant to others ahead of time, because then you can get a lot of these questions answered. And then good grant writing is like writing a good paper. And it's a little bit like, when you have a busy clinic and the attending is a little stressed, or if they haven't had coffee, and you've got a medical student that starts with a very long presentation, you're going to be like, okay, no, give me just the key points, what I need to know right now to help, manage this patient and keep the clinic going. So that's how you can think of grant writing, is give them what they need up front very clearly. And then if they want more details, then they're going to go into the methods section and really look for details as to how you'll do what you're proposing. So know what your audience cares about. And it's pretty, for FAME application, because they're smaller, there's a fair amount of latitude, but don't, basically what your content is, it really needs to respond to the RFA. And I'll give you an example. I wrote an R01 and submitted it, and it was for the wrong, this was initially when they basically, NIH switched the RFA from a clinical trial to non-clinical trial, or how they defined what a clinical trial is. And they didn't even look at it. They send it back and say, oh, sorry, thanks for the application, but this doesn't fit. So that was, 6 months just wasted developing something that it didn't fit the actual announcement. So that's why it's really important, if you're not sure, to go ahead and contact the funding agency and just say, do these aims fit what you're looking for before you put in the work? And the last thing I'm going to say here is you're really laying out an argument. So if you're arguing for or against something, then just think about what all you would need to support or refute, and how, and if you make those things sort of the key pieces of your heading, that always helps. So for example, if I'm studying effects of mental stress in chest pain, then in my significance section, I would talk about chest pain, that it's a problem. I would talk about how mental stress is a problem and how they're linked, and what is known and what is unknown. So your key information or key pieces should be kind of your section headings. Figures, I go back and forth about this, because figures are great for presenting your pilot work and for the methods and protocols, visit 1, visit 2, patient visit, things like that. Figures for the background and significance part if you really need it to demonstrate a specific concept, then I think it's good. But if it's going to just cause the reviewer to criticize it more because there's not enough arrows connecting X, Y, and Z, then I would not use up the space in the background to use a figure. So it just kind of depends on whether it's helpful to kind of summarize your aim. You know, sometimes people will turn their aims into a figure. If you can do it clearly, okay, but otherwise don't worry about trying to do a figure in the background. And then, of course, when you do the figures, I'll show you some examples of just labeling it clearly and then constantly asking yourself, so what? So you're proposing something, and if you're writing a sentence or two or a paragraph, is it really needed? Because if it's not needed to make your argument, if it's not going to help, then just cut it out. You know, you can have things written, but then when you're kind of reading it through and the entire grant, you can say, okay, I don't really need this piece, then get rid of it and pick out things that are not clear and don't call attention to it. Just delete it. And then remember, like I said, it's okay to restate what you're going to do because it's kind of telling the reviewer why the proposal is relevant. So here's an example of a figure. And remember, color figures are good if they're going to be looking at it on their computer screen, but if they're printing it out, then of course it's going to be black and white. So sometimes it's good to use different symbols to, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but good to use different symbols in case it's black and white that they're looking at. And then also when you do your headings or descriptions at the bottom of the figure, just make sure that the font in there is big, because otherwise if they can't read it's not, you know, they will not be happy and just kind of lose interest. I always thought that it was good to put a border around the figures like I have shown you here, and then embed it, you know, within, just to make it look nice. So divide up the content into short paragraphs, clear topic sentences, and I'll show you some examples of that. Use labeling tools. So okay to do boxes, bold, italics, underline. You don't want to do it too much so that then it doesn't look organized, because then they are seeing all kinds of stuff everywhere. But you want to try to use it when you want to break up the sections, and then paying attention to the layout to make sure that the figures are aligned properly, especially when they get turned into a PDF. So here's is an example. You can see here, as I was talking, and this is in the significance section for microvascular. And I wanted to highlight that this is a condition that's associated with major adverse outcomes. So I just underlined that particular sentence within the paragraph of the microvascular. And because this was a grant that was specifically focused on women, I underlined the sentence that's specifically saying why this is a problem in women. Here's an example from one of Neil's grants, I believe. And what you see here is the section heading. So cost considerations have been ignored in efforts to enhance shared decision-making. Clear, you know, clear phrase here. And then you can see here where he's italicized, if you read this last sentence, unless medical benefits are overwhelming, alternatives non-existent, or cost very low, translating patients' values and preferences into decisions and identifying potential solutions requires discussing cost. So this last part that he has italicized, it kind of tells the reviewer that, hey, yeah, this is important, and this is what I'm emphasizing, and this is what this grant is about. And then if you look at the next paragraph, what he's bolded and italicized, the ideal process will account for how patients approach cost-benefit trade-offs and identify patients whose preference based on cost or other considerations conflict with default option. So clearly, you know that this is what he's trying to get to. That's what he's proposing, that you need to include patients and talk about cost, and it's clearly emphasizing that part. Here's another example in the significance section where you can highlight this project thus responds directly to the this RFA's stated interest in advancing human subjects protection and exploring novel methods of informed consent. So if you're writing a FAME grant, you say this project, this pilot work from FAME, because FAME is not a lot of money or, for a lot of, it's a limited period of time. So this pilot project, from the FAME grant is expected to lead to enough pilot data for a larger grant, specifically to advance information related to X, Y, and Z. Here's an example. I know this is not part of the background slide. This is more of an AIMS page slide, but I thought it was important because the AIMS page is the most important page. Your first page is the most important one. So if you look at the way this, let's look at this example here of specific AIM 1. It says to clarify patients and surrogates' experiences, concerns, and preferences regarding enrollment decisions in acute MI and stroke research. That's what and then principal method, survey and key stakeholder interviews. That's how they're going to do this AIM, carry out this AIM. Specific AIM 2, develop content-sensitive approaches to involvement in research participation in acute cardiovascular illness. And then the method they're going to use is collaboration with experts to translate AIM 1 data into model processes. Okay, so if a reviewer reads this versus look at the structure of this, where look at the difference here. So they decided to bold the AIM, and then how they're going to carry out the AIM is in a sub, is not bolded, but it's clearly sort of separate. It's principal method, and this is how we're going to do it. So this is clearer as opposed to reading something like this, right? So this is sort of an example of how to break things up using bolding and italics, etc. Here's another example where you can put a border around critical gap. So AIMS 1 and 3 specifically assess X, Y, and Z and how they are treated. And so this is a critical gap that this grant is going to try and answer. Here's another example from a GI related grant. And what you see here is the section headings that I thought were nice and wanted to show this, where in the background and significance, they've highlighted esophageal symptoms are unresponsive to PPI therapy in 40% of cases. I mean, that's important. That makes me say, oh, wow, 40% of cases don't respond to PPI. I want to read more. And then A2 is esophageal motility disorders could be responsible for these symptoms. And it's a specific disorder that requires lower esophageal sphincter. Okay. And then at the very last, the way they've ended this paragraph by bolding it, identifying this problem of how the esophageal sphincter relaxes is relevant because of XYZ, and it can be an effective treatment. So this this brings up sort of the importance of the problem, the burden of it, that there's a clear pathology that we can go after, and this is how we can treat it. So, this is why this grant should be funded. So I will end there. I'm right at about 35 minutes or so, and I will take questions. Hopefully this is what you were looking for.
Thank you very much, Puja. That was awesome talk. Thank you so much. So do any of our participants have questions? Feel free to fire away.
You can throw tomatoes too, but you know.
I guess to break the ice here, I'll start. I'll ask you a question or make a comment, I guess.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking about the highlighting of your, pieces of your grant, phrases, statements, etc. As a reviewer, there's also there's a fine line, right? I mean,
yeah.
Because for example, when I review, I think of someone telling me a story, and when I read like this highlight or italics or underline, I'm trying to figure out what is there. I get distracted by that, I guess. So there's a distraction element if you have too much highlighting of phrases or statements in your grant.
Yes, absolutely. And one thing I should say is that sometimes when you're preparing your revision grants, instead of highlighting all the changes by bolding, because you're revising it extensively and everything is bolded, so that doesn't look good because that's hard to read. Sometimes people will put a line next to the paragraphs that you have changed, so just like a vertical line on the side, or you just say in the front, up front in the response to reviewer, just say we've made extensive changes in this application, and these are the changes we've made, and just summarize it kind of on the first page in the response, and then not go through too much of the highlighting. The highlighting, the bolding, and the italics, I use it when you're trying to break up sections, and I'll underline it if it's something key and important that I want the reviewer to kind of hone in on.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The other thing I agree with everything you're saying about the conceptual figure. If you have a conceptual figure in your, like, even on your specific aims page, if you have room, but it is valuable real estate that you're using up. But just having that, even if you don't use it in your grant, you doing that process to organize yourself is actually very helpful. You might not use it in the grant, but in planning and developing your proposal, that is helpful, I think.
Yes.
With arrows, and
yeah, no, absolutely agree. And so I'll give you, so my first K-23 training grant, I was studying mental stress and abnormal vascular function, coronary function. So I had a figure where I had the brain with an arrow for mental stress going into the heart, and all the different ways that I was going to measure this phenomenon of mental stress and effects on the heart. And I'd submitted it, and then when I circulated it to the mentors, somebody said, well, it's pretty simple. You just got the brain and you've got the heart and you've got an arrow going down. And it's just kind of is oversimplification because there's so much else. There's the adrenals, there's the blood vessel constriction. And do you even need this figure? And I said, no, I think you're right, that they're going to criticize that I made it too simplistic. And so I took away the figure, but it helped me write the grant. So I had it drawn just for myself, but I didn't ultimately include it in the grant.
Hi, I had a question. There's like a limit of how many pages you're supposed to include in your grant, but my project is a patient education tool, and so if I include it as an addendum, like an example, like a first draft of something like that, is that a good thing to do or not a good thing to do?
Do you mean the actual educational program, just putting that as an addendum to see what you're proposing?
Yeah.
I would say that the main things from your actual program should be in the methods, right? Because you're going to describe what it is that you're doing, how you're going to evaluate it. So all of that should be in the main, part of the grant and in the methods of how you'll do it. Submitting the entire sort of thing as an addendum, usually I only do that if it's, people are usually not interested in the technical aspects of, so for example, if I'm submitting like an MIBG, protocol for cardiac imaging, people don't necessarily want to know every single detail of how you're going to image the patient. They're just going to trust that, okay, you've got expertise in nuclear medicine, they're going to help you do this. So I just give them the key pieces that I'm going to use this much of the isotope. It's going to be injected in the morning. They're going to be fasting, So I think that for your process of an educational program, I think you need to give them the key elements of what you are proposing to somebody who knows nothing about it, and I think that that's what they're going to really look at. I don't know that you have to have the entire thing in detail submitted. If you wanted to as an addendum, I don't know, are addendums allowed in the FAME grants? I don't think so.
No, we're not gonna, I don't think we're having addendums.
Yeah, because it's just 6 pages. And you wouldn't want to, put that in there.
I mean,
Okay,
I think that's
good
a
advice.
great answer, Puja, because yeah, a lot of times the reviewer is not interested in the nuts and bolts. I mean, they have kind of, they're not checking all the movements that you make or all the steps that you're taking. So yeah, and that's the challenge of the space that you're given for writing the grant is like, how do you fit that big program into a little space? But that's part of the process here.
Yeah. Another example is like, if you're writing a grant, right? And saying, okay, blood will be drawn to collect biomarkers. I used to, when I would first write it, I would say, an IV will be placed and, blood will be collected in 2 red top tubes and green, red top tubes, 5 ml. People don't care, they trust that you'll get blood drawn. So you just say 30 mLs of blood will be drawn in the morning in a fasting state. Then, you don't have to give them gory details.
Well, I have the mic. Can I ask maybe a corollary question? It really sounds like, you have to be very succinct and to the point because people are going to be reviewing grant after grant after grant proposal. So for the FAME grant, like how many applicants on average do you get per year?
That would be a
Sarah?
referrals or
Yeah. I mean, I would say in the last couple,
About 10, maybe.
yeah, I was gonna say like 12, 10.
Yeah, I mean, for the reviewers of the FAME grant, I don't think you have to worry about those pictures.
Yeah.
With the head on the computer or the hose of information. So, but they're not going to be experts in your, project, right? I mean, they'll know some about your project, but they're not going to know it as well as you. So that's, the background and significance is telling that story to someone who has some sort of basic knowledge of what you're doing, but you're filling that in with, what are the real important parts of what you're doing. I don't know. I like when I review grants, the background and significance is like could be a nice story,
Yeah.
like reading the newspaper and learning something, or that kind of thing, like reading a good non-fiction book. If you do that kind of thing, I guess.
Mhm. And it's only because it's 6 pages. It's, I'd probably just make it like 1.5 pages to 2 pages. I wouldn't go more. Like some people just give you so much background up front, then they run out of space for, what you're actually planning to do and all
Yeah.
the, addressing, because it's also important to like, okay, you're planning to do this, and if it doesn't, all the kind of anticipating, like, for example, let's say I'm going to recruit 30 people, then you have to convince the reviewer that, yes, you will be able to recruit these 30 people in this amount of time. And, how are you going to go about doing it? So, and then alternative plans, strategies, limitations. So all of those things are part of that approach section. And then the statistics and how you're going to analyze the data, et cetera. So the significance, I think, about a page and a half is what I would try to aim for. Definitely less than 2 pages.
Thank you for the talk, Dr. Mehta.
Absolutely.
I had a question regarding the first page of the aims, goals, objectives. I've looked at several colleagues and mentors grant proposals, and to me, I'm getting caught up over the semantics. To me, aims and goals and objectives, it's all very redundant. And so I really appreciated the example that you presented with the aims, with the arrow and the principal method. Is it sufficient to just do that? Like, what exactly is the difference between aims, goals, and objectives here?
Yeah, so the aims page should, of course, have the words aims.
Right.
So you'll say, I mean, it's just one of these things where you're going to say, in order to study this issue or to test this hypothesis, we plan to carry out these aims, or, the following aims are proposed, and then specific aim 1, 2, 3. Usually what I do is before that, I say the overall goals of this project. So if you have, for example, if your overall goal is to try to understand the mechanisms of how mental stress leads to heart disease and adverse outcomes. Okay, so that's your overall goal of this project. But how are you going to study it? Well, I'm going to study it by aim 1, bringing people in and exposing them to mental stress. Aim 2, doing something else, and aim 3, doing something else. So your overall goal is X, but then your aim to test that goal is ABC. Hopefully that helps.
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to ask, for something like the FAME grant, which is supposed to be more of a pilot, like how many aims are we expected to be presenting? Like, is it, I'm getting the sense that 1 to 3 is pretty standard, but is it just however many it takes to do your project?
That's a really good question. Yes, however many it takes, but typically you do have to convince the reviewer that if you're proposing 3 aims in such a short time, like in a year or 2, you have to really convince them that you're able to do it, right? So otherwise they'll say, well, this was kind of ambitious. If you just have 1 aim, you say, well, is that really, are they proposing enough to do? But if that aim is broken up into sub-aims, or if it's an extensive enough thing, then I think it's fine. So if you convince them, if you say, hey, my aim is to set up a registry of patients who have had Takotsubo in the Emory system, and I'm going to set it up with X, Y, and Z, collecting this data in this 1 year, then, people will say, wow, this is very practical. It's doable. It's low cost. Let's give it to them. So I think, but because if you've convinced them that Takotsubo is a big problem, there's a lot of unknown. Nobody's looked at this in the Southeast. There's a lot of stress around here, So I think that whether it's 1 aim or 3 aims, I think you just have to convince them that you can do it in the time that's proposed and be realistic. And because sometimes you'll get comments that this was just too ambitious. They just didn't think it was a great project, but they just don't think that you can do it in a year, with like the 20% time that you have to carry out the work, right? So then up front, I would probably say in the limitations and just say, recognize that this is just a small start pilot information. And if we're successfully able to carry this out, then we will expand it to make it bigger. The database will be already set up or whatever, that we'll be able to continue this work, making it bigger so that you don't get criticized for not proposing enough.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
just a
Puja,
quick
ahead.
semantics question. Are we to use the AMA format for citations on the references page? I didn't see that in the.
You can do it however you want.
Okay.
Usually I just use Endnote or some kind of reference manager, and but that's the typical.
Okay.
For FAME in particular, right, you're talking about specifically?
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't think we have any stipulations on how the bibliography is formatted.
Okay.
Just as long as we, as a reviewer, can figure out what reference you're talking about. You guys have EndNote? Everyone knows. That was something that I learned as a grant writer. I guess everyone has EndNote now, right?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you a funny story. So, when I was working with Kathy Grinling, my first paper was a review on angiotensin II and cardiovascular disease. Okay. So I had like 250 something references, and I didn't know about EndNote. Like I just, you're like, okay, just writing away. And then I would just type, so then when I sent it to her and she would make edits and change sentences around and stuff, I would go back and redo the references. And after like, it was, so then fortunately I was meeting with her in person. And so she moved the sentence around, and then she said, it's not formatted, what did you use? And I'm like, I just typed them. She's like, you need to learn EndNote.
That's a great story.
I can see Kathy's face.
You got to keep that one.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I do have another question, and it's sort of maybe more FAME grant specific. Is it okay if I ask it?
Yes.
In terms of the funding for the FAME grant, is that mostly to fund the protected time, or some for the project administration, or how does that work?
You want
Sarah,
to?
you want to answer? It's all salary.
Yeah.
No other costs. Is that's
Okay, got
pretty,
it.
that's pretty,
Straightforward.
pretty straightforward.
Thank you.
I mean, the way people have done this in the past is if you have some of those costs, that's what your mentor is going to help you with.
And on the FAME page, we have created kind of like a one-page document that lists out all of the resources that the department and even some, I think, at the CTSA and the school level offer. So some of that can be like getting a medical student to assist you in some work, the DAB Core program, stuff like that. So there is that. If you want to check that document out, it's on the main FAME page.
Okay.
Wait, I just want to say, again, I'll want to thank you again, but there was a couple things you said also that I wanted to follow up on. And one is like, reviewers are busy and they have, a stack of
Stuff to
grants to read and then other stuff to do and go to clinic, et cetera. But, you know, there is a sense that you are, you know, paying back or paying forward, or, you know, someone read your grant and you were the golden rule, I guess, you know, do
Yeah,
unto others as you want done unto you, I guess, right? So, that, I think that's a very pervasive sentiment in reviewer committees.
yeah. Well, that's like, a lot of academic things, when you get asked to do, well, this talk is actually a perfect example.
Yeah.
So when Sarah
We're not
asked me to when Sarah asked me to give this talk, I said, oh, well, I'm gonna, I'm about to head to clinic to finish up the stuff from yesterday. And I said, okay, I can do it on a Friday at 8 o'clock. Well, can I do it? And I said, I really should, because when I was
Yeah.
writing my pilot, somebody gave this, this type of talk at Cedars, and it was helpful or whatever. So there's a lot of that, where you want to, and that's also when you send reviewers or mentors or peers or whoever circulate your grant to look at it before you actually submit it. That's also the same thing, where they're trying to help you write something and, give their comment and feedback.
And the other thing I wanted to follow up on was what you said about reading the RFA, reading the announcement, the funding announcement very closely and carefully.
Yeah.
That's I echo that.
Yeah.
thought. Okay, well, we're at the top of the hour. Thank you again, Puja, and
Thank you. Good luck, everyone.
I guess many of you will be meeting with your coaches, hopefully.
All right.
And we have one more talk in this series, and that's next Friday at 8 o'clock.
All right. Great.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Puja.